Welcome everybody to linuxacademy.com. My name is Terry, and in today's video we're going to continue our exploration of Nginx, the warp-powered web server. So today we're going to look at some additional vhost configuration directives. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the Upstream module. So what the Upstream module allows us to do is to define groups of servers that we can reference and manage using a number of keywords within our vhost configuration, like proxy pass, fast CGI pass, SCGI pass, and memcache pass. So let's take a look at what that means in terms of our configuration. So the first thing that we've done is we're going to use a Node.js application that is simply going to serve an index.html file on port 8888. And in fact, if we go to var www and HTML, I've already created a directory called node that actually contains the code for the HTTP server that we're going to be using. If you're following along and you want to know exactly what we've done to configure this, we'll include the source code for the Node.js file, which if you take a look at it here, simply is setting up the server itself, and in this case it's going to listen on port 8088, and all it's going to do is serve the index.html file. It's a static file server. Now what we did install is, for those of you following at home, you'll have to install Node.js, and that's in CentOS. You can install that by doing a sudo yum install Node.js. And you'll also install npm, which is the Node.js package manager. It allows you to install dependencies and mark dependencies in your Node.js file. Obviously, Node.js is outside of the scope of in-depth coverage for this particular video. We're simply using it as something that we can demonstrate the Upstream directive in our example for. So the next thing we want to do in our configuration is, let's go ahead and do a VI on etc hosts. So as we did for the example vhost, we're going to create a host entry using our existing IP address. And in this case, let's call it www.mynode.local. So now that we have a localhost entry for the Node application itself, just like we've done for our example domain, we can start up our Node server, and then we'll demonstrate that we can connect to it, and then using the Upstream directive, how we can use Nginx to manage our connections to that particular service. So if we do a node server.js, and we're going to just start up the application in the background, we'll see that it says it's running on localhost port 8888. Now we have to make sure that we have an index file, which we haven't created yet, so let's make sure we do that, and we'll say this is our test node file, and then we'll pipe that to index.html just so we have some content to serve. So let's do a links on HTTP localhost port 8888, and it says this is our test node file. So our test node file is just the index text file that we created, and that's what we're serving under port 8888. However, we can use Nginx to serve this content by creating what's called an upstream reference to a service running on a particular port. Now, some people will call this proxying the port for port 80, which it effectively is, but what we're doing is we're inserting Nginx in front of the connective service for our Node.js application. So we do that by creating a new vhost file for our domain, and if you remember, we called it in etc hosts, we called it our www.mynode.local, and if we make sure that it actually is responding, then we can go create our local host file. So let's change to our etc nginx, and in our case, because of our configuration, vhost.d. If you set it up under sites available and sites enabled, then that's perfectly acceptable. In our case, we're using the vhost.d configuration. And we'll create a simple vhost file that uses our upstream directive. So let's go ahead and do a VI on www.mynode.local, and again we call it .conf so that it maintains the consistency and actually loads the configuration file when we start it, which we'll test by using an nginx -t as we've talked about before. So in our previous vhost, we started by defining our server, but in this case, we're going to use the upstream directive. And what that does is it says, I'm going to create a reference to something within this module. So we'll just call this my node. And this is how we'll refer to this upstream configuration from within our server configuration in the vhost. So we'll get to that in a second. So now if we do a server, and we're going to say, hey, this is just localhost on port 8888, we have to end that with a semicolon. That's all there is to it. In this case, we're simply going to connect to localhost on port 8888 wherever we refer to that particular upstream directive as my node. So in our case, we're just going to create a server. We're going to say that the location that we want to load is in under this configuration. We're going to say proxy pass. And all this is going to do is connect to the directive that we just set up called my node. So my node and end. Now right before the location though, we do want to add the server name directive so that we know we're connecting to www.mynode.local. So all of this is saying is that when we receive a connection request for the server name www.mynode.local, we want you to pass as a proxy over port 80, because it's just over HTTP, my node, which is localhost 8888. So if we have now done that right, we should be able to do an nginx-t, which will tell us that the configuration file syntax is okay. And then we'll want to do a service nginx restart. Now once we've restarted, we should then be able to, and we should still be able to see that if we do a links HTTP localhost on 8888, we see this is our test node file, so we'll quit that. We also should be able to do a links HTTP www.myexample.local, which gives us a different file, www.myexample.local. And now we should be able to proxy our connection by doing a links HTTP and www.mynode.local, which should give me the mynode test node configuration file. So upstream is simply a way of referring to one or more servers, and it can be servers or services running on particular ports or in pipes that you want to be able to proxy the connection to using Nginx. And the advantage of using Nginx, for example, to proxy a connection to using an upstream directive to a Node.js application, for example, is because you may have the Node.js application listening on a particular port for a RESTful API or for providing some type of information from a back-end database, but it doesn't have all of the logging facilities built into it that you would expect for an HTTP service. So by proxying that through Nginx, we can log errors, access logs, etc. using our typical Nginx HTTP logging service as it's configured either universally or from within our vhost. So that's all there is for the upstream directive. In a future video, we'll look at how we can use that for proxying and load balancing. But for now, my name is Terry for Linux Academy.